Debbie Smith from Restorative Practices Integration Associates, here with Kusum Crimmel, a good friend of mine, also a Restorative Practices practitioner, trainer, coach, all the things really, y'all. She'll go into deeply the work that she does in regards to restorative practices and her racial justice work. And so this month, Spotlight is going to be really interesting because it's going to be different from the other conversations that we've been having. Most likely we'll have a part 2, so look out for that. But we're going to start off just as we normally do by asking our guest, Kusum, what was it that brought restorative justice, restorative practices work? And how have you brought your own personal gifts into the work yourself?
Great question. I love the additional part of our personal, how do we bring it in? So I got into restorative practices actually very accidentally. I was working, I had my license in clinical social work. So I was at one point a school-based social worker working for a classroom with young people who had severe trauma. And that severe level of trauma created a lot of behavioral challenges in the classroom. So they got put into what's called a counseling enriched special day class. So I was leaving, had been in there for many years, and the principal at the school wanted to hire me on for working with the whole school. So not just in that program. So I left the clinical work and started working in the whole school under a grant called Safe and Supportive Schools program. She wanted me to do case management. And also at the school, there had been a conflict mediation program years before, but then when that person left, nothing had been put in its place. So they didn't have a program. She really wanted me to start one. And then at the same time, she wanted me to run what's called a positive behavior intervention and support program, which was PBIS in schools. And to be under as a restorative justice practitioner, even though I'd never been trained. Well, why don't you go to this training so you can at least know what's going on? I had done some transformative justice work previous many years ago when the transformative justice world kind of methodology and conversation and depth was starting to happen in the Bay Area, but I didn't get too in depth with it. So I thought at that time that it was the same thing. And so when I went to the restorative justice training, I'm like, okay, this isn't quite the same thing there. But what happened was I just fell in love with the process, the circle process, the people at the district who trained me, their competence, their depth, their ability to let people, to bring people to a real intimate and vulnerable place in a short period of time. The way that the restorative practices was aligned with closing and ending the school to prison pipeline was pretty huge. The way that it was connected to a larger societal and systemic change. And it wasn't just about dealing with conflict, but it was really a reorientation towards deeper connections and relationship. And there was something that just hit in me. I mean, even at the time I was getting trained in the PBIS stuff, and I was like, oh, I want to do restorative justice. This feels more aligned. And so at the time I wasn't considered a restorative justice person, but David Kusum, who is the person who runs the restorative justice program at Oakland Unified School District, just kept inviting me back to, they had monthly gatherings for all the RJ people, and said, yeah, just come and join us. Like learn, even if it's not your title, just learn. So I started going to those, and then everywhere I went, if I saw training, Rita Alfred, another practitioner in the Bay Area, I took trainings with her. I was involved with the organization Open Kids First, and they did RJ trainings through their work. And I got trained through them. And so I just kind of picked up as much as I could and kept going, and then practiced and started practicing. And so that's how I got started. Eventually, after several years, there was funding that was able to come into the school that I was working at. So they actually were able to hire me on as a full-time restorative justice facilitator practitioner at the school. So I was able to then kind of take the program and engage kind of what you're saying, like what is your personal pieces to it. I would add one of my major one of the ways in which I was strong, or I'm strong, is peer-to-peer training. So I had been working with teenagers for many, many years, and I loved training young people to be leaders. And that's one of my strong points. I love young people stepping in and really learning the skills themselves. To me, young people, especially in RJ practices, they are some of the best people to hold space. And I often will tell schools or people that I work with, it's not just the kids who are straight A students or doing all the things right. In fact, I found some of my most powerful facilitators from having to be in a circle because they had done something that caused harm in the past. So the messy kids, the kids that people don't want to deal with sometimes, like those are the young people that often they got drawn to this work. They get drawn because a lot of times people's frustration and anger and pain comes from them not having been seen. And RJ circling up, RJ practices allows people to be seen and understood for their fullness and their depth, and not just the behavior that they were doing. And so it makes sense to me that so many young people that previously had just been pushed out really felt drawn to this type of work. And so that healing aspect, that working with trauma, I was trained also in a modality called somatics in an organization called generative somatics, looking at how trauma and the things and life experiences that we've been through live in our bodies, that our bodies are a story or a book. And once we get more tapped into the body, we can understand more so what are the things that ignite us in all the ways, positive, harmful, and so I tend to integrate somatic practice also in my work.
I love that. I want to say just one quick thing about the somatic practices work and how that resonates for youth. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the student focus that you were talking about early, because one of the things that I love, y'all, about Kusum is how in our storytelling, like so many things line up in terms of our consciousness and how we see things and do things inside of this work, but also like specifically for the people that we work with. The somatic practices is so interesting to me because we're in restorative practices, we're supporting people with like mindfulness tools, right? We're supporting people with ways to self-regulate themselves so that they could better function inside of a community, right? You have to have those pieces, how to ground yourself. So we're working around all of these things, but we don't talk a lot about the somatic part of it, because and that's the thing that actually factors into some of the responses that those kids who are systematically and most consistently treated in punitive ways, like it's actually the way they're carrying themselves. It's the way they're expressing themselves with their bodies. And their bodies are an expression of all of the trauma that they've been experiencing in their lives, but also in school. Can you say a little bit more about how that factors into the work that you've done, especially with young people? What are some of the outcomes to the somatic practice work that you've done that kids find themselves working through some of their stuff through the somatic practices that you introduced to them?
I think when working with young people in circle, it's harder to really bring in somatic practices. I think when I'm facilitating circles, it's more so me witnessing other people's somatic body. And so I can kind of hear stories of their lives through how they speak, what they do, what's going on. And it is true that so often it's like a stance or even a tone in how people speak that creates how do I want to say this? Because I actually don't think it's the tone and how somebody is that creates issues, because I think that there can be so much anti-Black and dark skin bias with teachers, with administrators, with people particularly who live in European descendant bodies and white bodies. There's also the somatic response in those bodies to Blackness, to dark skin, to people who they perceive as other, as someone that is someone different. So I also talk a lot to educators around the body stance, the somatic experience of what happens when this particular behavior comes in. What is your automatic response? And because if we're thinking about the school to prison pipeline as an example of the way which systemic racism still happens in schools, yes, there's policies and rules and other things that impact it, and it's also body to body. It's when kids walk into a classroom and how they are, and how a teacher reacts to that person and decides if that person's going to get sent to the office or a phone call home based on their bodies, based on how they're perceiving and interacting with each other. So I just wanted to kind of reorient and think it's not just for the young people to think about their bodies, but it's also really to think for educators and adults in spaces, particularly adults who have many layers of privilege, whether it's racial privilege or gender privilege, class privilege. They obviously have adult privilege and educational privilege, just being adults in a school system working with young people. So we are constantly in relationship with each other's bodies. And when I'm working with young people, I think my main thing is to try to help them feel into their bodies so that they can know that their responses are learned over time, and they've become so embodied that it becomes like, oh, well, that's just my personality. That's just who I am. And I would disagree and say, no, it's actually just behavior over time that gets so ingrained in our bodies that it becomes natural reaction. And the way that we know transformation has happened is when we can, a behavior can happen even at times when we're highly in stress, right? Stress or chaos or things that are intense situations. When we behave in a changed way, that means we've really transformed. We've recreated a new way of being.
The thought of it in that way, from the other side of it, not just like what do I need to do in my Black body? What work do I need to do to shift your perception of who I am? But also, so it's not so much that, but also for the people that we work with, the educators that we work with, to think about what's going on thematically for them in this moment that has actually leading them to make a decision that they really don't want to make for that student, because most teachers care about their students. But then when we get into that, flight or fight, consciousness, when we feel like there's something that's happening that feels threatening to us, an attitude, the way someone is speaking to us, like you were saying earlier, in their tone, the body language, squaring up, or something like this, right? To educate people on one, like why those mannerisms are actually playing out like that. To support their understanding, just like trauma-informed practices, right? Like, so there's people who have trauma, and this is how it's expressed at times. This is how they perceive things. This is how they respond or react to things. Having that knowledge that, oh, okay, I understand this. Now let me actually address this in another way that's different from what I would have, right? So I love that from the perspective of the educator, how can we not only support them with that knowledge and information about other people, but also how to check in, thematically with themselves.
Right.
For sure. Thank you so much for ending on that note. Thank you so much for being Spotlight. We're definitely going to have this in 2 parts. And so I am inviting you all to check out our part 1 on our website, and also there will be a link on the YouTube channel for part 2. Thank you so much, Kusum. Keep doing the beautiful, wonderful work that you are doing. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Phoebe. Much love to you. So great to talk with you.
You too.